I feel we reached a very important moment. We are now going to engage in conversation with Professor Mapadimeng. It's my particular pleasure because I think that there is lots in common between coming to Poland and talking about South Africa. I assume that we will talk about post-apartheid South Africa, and Poland went through a major transformation in a very similar time as South Africa. The Nationalist Party basically in negotiation with the ANC in the outcome of it, first President Mandela steered the country into a new reality, and hopefully we will be able to engage in some kind of comparisons. Poland moved from authoritarian system in also through negotiated revolution, just like South Africa, in very similar time in the late 80s. So please welcome with me Professor Mapadimeng. I just wanted to share with you, he is the former president of South African Socjologii Society. He is the member of Executive Council of ISA. So we very much appreciate his contribution in this capacity here. He is a sociologist who is interested in culture and also in industrial relations and in labor studies. So I would like to welcome Professor Mapadimeng.
Thank you. Friends and colleagues, it's an honor and a privilege to be afforded this opportunity to do the presentation on, because it's more like a freestyle presentation, nothing really focused on a particular thing or topic. I want to give you a sense of the change that we went through in South Africa and where we are now today. What are some of the challenges, and I'll touch on some of my own research in terms of one of the issues that actually I'm going to talk about. Let me just start with the historical. As you are well aware, South Africa, like many other countries which were colonized, we did go back on the anti-colonial, anti-imperial struggles to bring about in African context, independence and also emancipation from colonial and imperial control. And in South African context, the organization that you know, which was led by Nelson Mandela, African National Congress, was the first major organization. There were other folks, but this one was the biggest. It started in 1912 as South African Native National Congress. And it was meant to bring together all Africans to fight against the colonial control and imperial control. And it started using delegations. They were not using very much militant approach or conflict approach. But those delegations with trying to negotiate and talk to the imperial government in UK, United Kingdom, and also within South Africa was not very effective until the 1940s, when the Youth League of this South African Native National Congress was established, and the Youth League became much more radical, led by young people, and of course in those days Nelson Mandela and many others were young who started this movement. They joined the movement, it was started earlier than them, of course, and they came to take up the leadership later. And that led to a conflict approach now, because they realized that it was pointless to use a negotiation when you're dealing with a ruthless regime, which was colonial and apartheid, later became apartheid. So they started to change the course of struggling, especially in the 1950s, following 1948, when the National Party took over. And then they started also, of course, under the heavy repression from the state, which led to which forced the liberation movement on the ground and into exile. During those years, there was a growing mobilization and active mobilization and resistance to, you will know, South Africa was racially divided, and then the white government, especially after 1948, when it became apartheid, they started to introduce policies of separate development. So that it was based on racial basis. There was always racial discrimination, but then they enforced it even more after 1948. And they came up with a policy of separate development, subdividing South Africa into ethnic, you find that what you have now today, the provinces, but then there was a section that we will refer to as white South Africa, or they will say South Africa and black people are not South Africans. They will force us into what they came to call reserves. And in those reserves, they only constituted 30% of the land. The land was taken from Africans, of course, through conquest 1913, with the act which was introduced. And this was reinforced throughout the years. So apartheid was actually a consolidation of this racial discrimination, prohibiting the racial interaction amongst Africans and all other South Africans. So this actually, of course, as I said, led to heavy repression, and the period of the 60s that followed. But before maybe before the 60s, let me mention this. The liberation movement was not only led by African National Congress, but also by the Pan-Africanist movement of Azania, called PAC, which was actually a splinter group that came off the African National Congress in 1959, when they declared the Freedom Charter as a document for freeing Africa, for freeing South Africa, and then envisioning what we need. And of course, PAC actually also went into exile. And you know, for instance, as part of the mobilization and protest and resistance, so many casualties we had so many casualties. 1960, when we had the Sharpeville massacre. In March, it was March, we had the Sharpeville massacre, where black people were killed as they were protesting against the carrying of the passes. Passes were like identity documents, but it was like a small booklet. Africans were restricted from living in the cities. So you will go into the city only for that period, or only if you are working for white people. And then after that, you get out. So Africans, we resisted that. And then the Sharpeville massacre was as a result of the protest led by Pan-Africanist Congress. And after it left the African National Congress, because they believed that the Freedom Charter, which was introduced by African National Congress, was a liberal document, which was a compromise. Then the 1960s, of course, was the period that was referred to as a period, a decade of relative peace. No much disturbances taking place because the liberation movement was forced into exile. Heavy repression by the state forces. And then the labor movement, of course, was represented by the South African Congress of Trade Unions, SATU, which was the precursor to the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU. So it was an allied approach. African National Congress with its allies, and then PAC, of course, went its own way. So they differed in terms of strategy. South African South African Indian Congress was also part of the alliance with African National Congress, and of course also South African Congress of Trade Unions. So, but they were forced into exile. 1960s was a period which was referred to as a period of relative peace in South Africa. It is the period in which also we saw a growth, incredible growth in terms of economic growth, because the apartheid state managed to repress any form of resistance. And then there is a period in which also the monopoly capital took off in South Africa in a very big way. But these conditions created what is referred to in the literature as apartheid capitalism. Apartheid capitalism, which means is a capitalism which was led by white people, white capitalists, and racially defined. But that did not actually discourage Africans from actually fighting up, regathering and fight the system of injustice. The 1970s, there was a revival. There was a revival of anti-apartheid struggle. That was internal struggle, led by the Black Consciousness movement of Tanzania, and in the form of, for instance, student movements, and also the organization that came to be referred to as Zapo. So the 1970s was a revival. We know, you might have heard about the Soweto revolts of 1976, when the young people actually went onto the streets, fighting apartheid, denouncing apartheid, or banning education in schools where they were forced to study in Afrikaans. They were demanding curriculum in their own language and also English. And of course, during this period also, the struggle also was led by the revival of African independent unions, trade unions, which started to organize in the shop floor. And then, of course, because of repression, they had to be strategic, working strategically to consolidate and demand rights for the workers. And then the period of the 70s started to see the revival of this resistance. Now, the economy was beginning to take a dive because it was becoming very unstable. The resistance movement also started to work closely with especially in the beginning of the 1980s, with the movement in exile, African National Congress, South African Congress of Trade Unions overseas. I mean, in exile, I mean to say, Pan-Africanist Congress of Tanzania. They started to connect and continue to resist the apartheid. And this intensified in the early 80s. During this period, the 3 decades, the economy grew in the 1960s, reaching about 8%, I think, 7 to 8% growth. In the 70s, it began to decline. Early 80s, there was a further decline. But during this period, the Africans actually organized through emphasizing non-racialism, organized through the United Democratic Front and also mass democratic movement, exerting a lot of pressure on apartheid state. And this happened throughout the 80s, calling for sanctions, working with African National Congress in various places, and especially in the UK, in London, where the leader of African National Congress, the president of African National Congress, Owar Tambo, was based in London. So they were mobilizing international sanctions against South Africa, apartheid South Africa. And this began to bear fruit. It was in the late 80s, when we started to see indications of signs of change. And as you remember, Nelson Mandela and many other leaders were in Robben Island. Then there was starting to have negotiations on how actually change, what kind of change is desirable. It is during this time that also the whole debate on the economy, economic policy, the future economy, how it should look like, actually was beginning to take place, the economic debate and the discourse. Of course, I mean, the liberation movement led by African National Congress was advocating for nationalization of the economy, which was more socialist. But then, in the context of debate, engaging there were also the liberal voices, which sought to actually preserve white monopoly capital. Now, in the process of negotiation, late 80s towards the 1990s, when South Africa was beginning to undergo change, what happens? Negotiations intensify. And in that process, a lot of differences in terms of how the economy should be handled, what kind of change should be actually introduced. And of course, as you can see, there was a beginning to be the ANC and its allied forces were beginning to make some compromises. And they were starting to talk about mixed economy. So the economy that will have both element of nationalization and also element of liberalism, of socialistic aspect. But remember, 1990, that's when the collapse of the Soviet bloc, where the liberation movement got a lot of support. And that meant that the capitalist system, the capitalist bloc was winning. And that happened even in this part of the world. So the collapse of the Berlin Wall, all of this, the compromises were beginning to be made during that transition. It was a difficult period. A lot of, I will tell you that the white South Africans, especially the Africans, the right-wing Africans, were resisting change. And then when we moved towards the election plot time, and when we were negotiating the new constitution, a lot of bombings taking place, the killing of one of the prominent African leaders in South Africa, the leader of ANC and South African Communist Party, Chris Hani, was killed during that time, 1992. It was a very tense moment. Our liberation came through very difficult. We shed blood. It was not a peaceful transition, as people say. Many people lost their lives. There was what they used to call black-on-black violence, sponsored by the apartheid government. To get black people fighting against each other, killing each other. So it was a very difficult time. But then during this change process, during this transition period, compromises were made, and then with the neoliberal idea, neoliberalism became triumphant, even on our economy. Then we started to have introduced the economic policy, which was very neoliberal. We moved away from the documents which were much more radical. So to nationalize our economy, to transform our economy. Then we moved towards the liberalization, which was consolidated in 1995, after the elections in 1994. And then the other thing that actually defined apartheid economy was that it was a protected economy. It was a protected economy which grew, that's why it grew so fast, because they didn't have any international global competition. But 1990, started to open up South African economy to global competition. And that actually presented its own challenges. And of course, even if you can see the trajectory of the economy in terms of the performance, as you can see, the 60s there was a high growth. 71 to 1980, as you can see, it started to decline to about 3%. And then 1981 to 1990, the economy was really battling. It was a very unstable environment in South Africa. 1991 to 2000, just during the first phases of democracy, after we had the elections in 1994, then we had the projections of 6% annual growth, but this was never achieved. Up to today, our economy is not growing, hasn't reached that level. Actually, at the moment, we're just about 1 point where we're back into our performance is back into 1981 to 1990, 1.6, in that range. So we're still battling in terms of, so there are many challenges that we are facing. And then, as you can see, in terms of today, I hope that gives you some of the rough presentation of the background. I'm just giving you a quick overview. And then today, I would say, in a democratic South Africa, we are facing major challenges and also some opportunities. As you can see there, one of the things that we did after 1994 was emphasis on redress. Reconstruction, development, reconciliation was the way to try and actually not divide the nation, to try and unite South Africa, eliminate racial discrimination or racially based system. Then we came up with a progressive constitution and progressive legislative environment, as you can see there. Within this context, there was a need. One of the important aspects of redress was to empower the historically marginalized, the historically disadvantaged, which were black people like me, to empower our black people. Then affirmative action was meant to actually achieve equity in terms of employment opportunities, in terms of all kinds of opportunities. Black economic empowerment was meant to actually create business opportunities for black people. As you can see now, that gave rise to the rise of the middle class, black middle class. Some are referring to us as the black diamonds, but I'm not sure about that because it's a contested issue. We're not even sure whether we are middle class or not. And of course, also the elite, this was an unintended outcome. Elite black petty bourgeoisie benefited from this. Some are multimillionaires. So we had that without empowering many other African people in the country. And of course, we also are facing multiple challenges like growing debt. As you know, we have been downgraded by the Moody's, Standards and Poor, because of corruption. Unemployment has gone high, especially youth unemployment. We have challenges of migration in South Africa. People from all over migrating into South Africa. That just makes the situation even worse. That's why you hear people are saying South Africa is xenophobic. But legislatively, in terms of legislation, the policies of South Africa are not xenophobic. It might just be where things happen. When people day to day are fighting over basic things, then xenophobic tendencies manifest themselves. But officially, we don't have that. Okay, so these are some of the challenges we are facing. And of course, the new socio-political movement, amidst all of this, in view of corruption, all of these problems, then we started to have, the African National Congress was the ruling party, as you know, and it still is. But now it has experienced disintegration. First, there are splinter groups because of unhappiness. It's a ruling party, was a former liberation movement, but now it's like solidarity yesterday. We were talking about solidarity yesterday about in Poland. Then we begin to have a situation of deterioration, lack of accountability, lack of commitment to helping the poor. Talking about it but not doing it. Then we had the first group that came out and became an opposition party called COPE, which is the Congress of the People, emerging from African National Congress, but it lost steam after that. We were hopeful that COPE will bring about a real change, will help us to actually mobilize and displace African National Congress. That never happened. And then recently, this one was even the economic freedom fighters. This is even more important because it came to change the balance of forces in government. It became a very strong opposition. There is another opposition, of course, which is more liberal, which is called Democratic Alliance. This one is a third major opposition in government. So, in a way, we are beginning to have a strengthening of our democracy, revival, activizing our democracy. As you can see, ANC allies also suffered because of the corruption from government. The trade union movement led by COSATU. Within the mining sector, there's a new union that came up. It is because you might have heard about the Maringana massacre, which happened in 2007, I think, when many mine workers were killed. And that actually, this union came out and they came to challenge them. So the union that belonged to COSATU lost membership, and this became a majority union. And the same in the metal sector. This NUMSA, NUMSA, is a very, very big affiliate, was one of the major affiliates of COSATU. And also that actually left COSATU to form I think they might actually work with the opposition, maybe with the EFF. So we don't know what's going to happen. But this revitalized our democracy, it's brought vibrancy to our democracy. We have an active civil society movement. But of course, others are issue-based, like for instance, treatment action campaign around HIV/AIDS treatment. We had a Soweto electricity crisis committee, which was focusing on electricity issues, water connections, and all this. So we have this. Our civil society is very active. Now, as you can see, because of these new parties led by young people, in our parliament and no more are you going to have this. As you can see, our president there, sleeping in parliament. Our president is sleeping in parliament. That is not the case anymore. No, as you can see, I say no more slumberland in our parliament. Young people are taking over. Young people are challenging and are demanding accountability to strengthen our democracy. As you can see there, this is what's happening in our parliament now. You see those red t-shirts, those red, it's not t-shirts, those are overalls for workers. This is economic freedom fighters led by young people, demanding, they show no respect for the president in that parliament. They tell him you are a thief. We're going to charge you. We're going to get you out of there. So he is never going to have any more peace in there until he gets out. As you can see, if you look at the other picture, that's when they protested and left parliament because they were resisting and actually saying, you are illegitimate, you are not our leader. So this is what's happening now. Now, we also have an activized student movement. But my concern with it, as you can see at the bottom, I'm saying it is sporadic, it's not coordinated properly, nationally or even regionally, but it's very spontaneous. Young people in our universities, our students, are demanding an end to colonial, anything colonial, yeah, they demand an end to that. They call it a fallist movement. They were demanding hashtag Rhodes must fall. Hashtag Rhodes must fall. Cecil John Rhodes was an imperialist from UK, John, from your country, you know. And also in Zimbabwe. He went on to settle in Zimbabwe. They used to call it Rhodesia. So young people are demanding that all of the symbols, everything, the curriculum, which is very colonial, normal. Young people are saying to us, as academics, as teachers, change now. We want change now. We are tired of being taught using the literature which is foreign to our experiences. We want scholarship that speaks to our own experiences. As you can see, hashtag colonial education must fall. Hashtag patriarchy must fall. Women are taking up the space. I say women, the interest of women, also equality. And we are responding through Pan-Africanism, Afrocentrism, indigenous knowledge systems. We are beginning to explore this as an alternative. Otherwise, as professors, we are risking becoming irrelevant. We don't want to become irrelevant. So we have to start going into this. I'm arguing that, for instance, in my view, this calls for what you call an intercultural dialogue. Intercultural dialogue, how does it work? I argue that it has to be a dialogue amongst equals or between equals. You can't have a sensible, meaningful intercultural dialogue if it is not based on equal. It has no equal footing on it. You have to be equals to engage in a meaningful one. Otherwise, it's pointless. So that's why we're being challenged to come up with our own sources. And as you can see, that's basically the challenges that do. So we have challenges, but we are not sitting back. Young people have always been the engine of change. They always led change in South Africa, from the 1940s up to where we are today. So we don't take young people for granted. Those are the future of our country. As you can see, students here, hashtag fees must fall. They say no more fields. We want free education. We can't afford it. Corruption is sucking out the national resources. We demand free education. We demand equality. As you can see there, hashtag fees must fall. Hashtag outsourcing must fall. So they connected the interests of the students with the interests of the workers. That the workers must be employed by the universities and be protected. As you can see there, this is an inspiration we have. 1976, that black and white picture, is 1976 when young people in Soweto led the struggle against Bantu education or apartheid education. And today, this is now, as you can see, young people are taking an example from there, the inspiration from the 1970s. So that culture of struggle and resistance is still there. So that's a hope for our democracy. That's a hope that will make sure that our democracy works for people. We have other challenges, as you can see, that I did not mention, or I did mention, for instance, migration challenges, youth unemployment. These are the challenges. In terms of the decolonizing scholarship and educational curriculum, including in schools, where we still have a major challenge, there, as you can see there, we have what we call, I don't know why this thing is, it cuts off okay, it's better this way. African indigenous knowledge system is one way in which I argue that, this is my view, we can help to bring about decolonization of our scholarship, and especially the curriculum. And this lady, Emma suggested that this is how we should go about it. And she makes a very interesting case for that. I saw Ethiopia, Benin. In Ethiopia, there's that debate is very deep into that social media, I can say. We have one of our scholars who passed away not too long ago, Achima Feji, who argued for deconstructionist approach, to deconstruct colonial thinking and come up with a completely new look on life. And then post-colonial scholarship is another one which was advocated by the late Cloud Oke. As you can see, that's cited in our sector, 2008. So these are some of the ways in which they are proposing ways in which we can get out of this, but we have challenges. Remember, we are colonized. Remember, we are oppressed. Remember, we are told that you are not better than anyone. That you are not good enough. You know what I mean? That your culture is less important. You know what I mean? We were told that, and our people still have that in their minds. You know what I mean? So we have a challenge. And this, as you can see, 1988, the late Mapadimeng, the professor from Nigeria, political economist, argued that was challenging this colonial education. But he said, as Africans, we are organizationally and intellectually not ready. We have to get ready to challenge this. And if you look at Vibke Kim, this is my friend from Germany, Vibke, in 2011, when she was looking at counter-hegemonic, doing a counter-hegemonic assessment in terms of our sociology and the practice of sociology, she found that, yes, South Africa is beginning to make inroads, but there is still a challenge. Structural constraints, like we still all want to publish in so-called prestigious journals of the West. You know what I mean? Those are the challenges we are facing. We have to take ownership of our scholarship. And then we have what my colleague in South Africa, Ari Sitens, he was a former vice president for programs in ISA. He says we have mental barricades. We have to overcome mental barricades. So these are the challenges that we are facing. There's the other colleague, for instance, in my university, who actually presented his inaugural lecture for professorship, who said, we need to be detoxified, we need to detox. He was using an African word for that. Something like that. I think it might be the Shona. To detoxify, like to vomit and get out that toxic stuff, and then to revive ourselves. To get ourselves together again, so that we can confront these challenges. So there are ways that we can deal with this. There are challenges though. We need to confront those challenges. I think that's the last one. Thank you so much. I hope it's